America's history of racial prejudice towards its black citizens and other people of color has been well documented. However, one of its most overt acts of racism was a subject that for years many people either chose to forget about or not speak of: the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II.
We boarded the train and no one knew where we were going. But as we got on the train, they made us pull the window shades down, and we left Arcadia, California, and a couple days later, we ended up in a place called Vocation, Wyoming, or better known as Heart Mountain Relocation Center.
And they packed us like cattle into the ferry boat, and I was still weak. And I was short because I was just 6. So all of us got packed in there, and had it not been for the bodies, I think I wouldn't have been able to stand up. They wouldn't let us sit. We were just packed in there.
The FBI came to our house and brought my father away. We didn't know where he was going or what he was charged with. In fact, he was gone for about 3.5 years, and sometimes we didn't know where he was, and he was never charged with anything.
Well, when I first went to Poston, as the bus drove into our camp area, the dust was so terrible that I didn't know whether I should be breathing or not, because it was real bad. And of course, this came to haunt me later on, because I came down with valley fever because of the dust.
In the early days of World War II, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them U.S. citizens, were forcibly evacuated from the West Coast and placed in internment camps. The order that sent them there, Executive Order 9066, signed by President Roosevelt in 1942, also placed restrictions on citizens of enemy countries living in the United States. But ultimately, only the Japanese Americans, our own citizens, were singled out for internment. How could this happen? How could a country that was fighting for the freedom and civil rights of the world deny those rights and freedoms to some of its own people with no evidence of disloyalty? The answer to those questions starts with the attitudes that existed toward Japanese Americans before the war.
There was a systematic anti-Japanese and what they then called Oriental feeling, and it had taken all sorts of forms as legislation. They were hemmed about by custom and law, and they were a reviled people. And so when World War II broke out, there had been a long history of anti-Japanese sentiment.
Like going to the beach when I was a little, toddler, almost sort of 4 or 5 years old. And I remember my dad said, well, we have to leave now. And I said, why? Well, they don't want Japs here at the beach.
These attitudes were the starting point for the internment camps. But what are attitudes? Where do they come from?
Attitudes are collections of thoughts and beliefs that are created around specific items in our environment. As we're first introduced to those items, we create associations between certain kinds of thoughts and beliefs, so that when those come up again, we have easily accessible information for those. It's a way of organizing information for ourselves.
Attitudes are based on values that we derive typically from our family, and as such, then, attitudes become ways that we define our experiences, what we move towards, what we move away from, what we say we like or what we say we dislike.
Our attitudes toward other people often depends upon the categories into which we place them. This process is called social categorization.
Social categorization involves labeling another person, identifying them or defining them in terms of the social group they belong to or the social category they're in. Male, female, old, young, one ethnic group versus another.
A common way to categorize people is whether they belong to the same group we do, the in-group, or another group, the out-group.
In-group, out-group refers to whether or not the other person is in the same social category as we are. Right? They're also a man. They also go to this university versus another university. So in-group members are ones we share category membership with. Out-group people are those who belong to other groups or organizations.
We almost overwhelmingly tend to favor people who are like ourselves. This is called in-group bias. The flip side is our tendency to be disfavorable toward the out-group.
In general, the more similar another person is to us, the more we like them. The more dissimilar they are, the more we dislike them or we have negative attitudes toward them. You can see it in your own life. Somebody who dresses differently than you do, acts differently than you do, you're suspicious.
By 1941, the second generation of Japanese who were born in the United States and were citizens by right of birth had been so Americanized that many did not realize the full impact of Pearl Harbor. In spite of attitudes against them, they did not see themselves as an outgroup, and so they did not see themselves at risk.